The violence that had been building up suddenly erupted at this prison a year last January. In a racial brawl, 3 black prisoners were shot down and killed by a white guard in a gun tower. A few days later, a white guard was murdered in retaliation. 3 black prisoners were charged with the killing. The prison was Soledad, and the accused became known as the Soledad brothers. George Jackson was regarded as being the ringleader.
Was the incident for which you're charged now, was it a revolutionary act on your part?
You asking me to confess to something? As a
Unless you wanted to. Did you kill the man?
Look, one of the most important elements of guerrilla warfare is to maintain secrecy. I've killed nobody until, you know, it's been proven. And they'll never be able to prove anything like that.
What's up, what it do? Welcome back to the DC Blacks channel, man. I'm your man, Eon Williams, and today I think we're gonna touch on something that's real important to me. That's the George Jackson story, and the George Jackson story is not a new story. You know, in all actuality, George Jackson transcended to the next life in 1971, so it's really an old story, but based on the fact that a few guys just came home and other people didn't know who they were, and I'm not even gonna mention their name, and they were guys that went away in the 80s. A lot of my younger homies didn't even know who they were. So that kind of motivated me to go ahead and do this George Jackson story. So in brief, for those who don't know about George Jackson, you know, I just want to touch on it on the surface a little bit, just to educate my young homies and my young followers or subscribers or viewers that don't know who he is, and maybe even some of my older ones that don't remember or don't know. But nevertheless, George Jackson is an iconic figure when it comes to prison reform and revolutionary action.
In October, radical chic came to the gates of the prison when a champagne party of 150 people was held to celebrate the release of Jackson's book, Soledad Brother. Though some in the prison system would dispute Jackson's credibility as author, the book was the apex of his prison transformation.
So that book was accepted in high regard, and he wrote about, you know, things he was going through.
Soledad Brother became a sensation, an international bestseller praised by the New York Times. Jackson was called the successor to Malcolm X. Black Panther Huey P. Newton said, "George was the greatest writer of us all."
Well, how we got what's called an indeterminate sentence, which was 1 to life. So if you get 1 to life like he got, you could go to prison. You could spend 1 year in prison, or you could spend life in prison.
Sent to CYA, California Youth Authority camp, for several months. He escaped, fled back to Chicago, was involved in a knifing, came back to California in chains.
After spending time locked up in the California Youth Authority, Jackson graduated to state prison when he pled guilty to the robbery of a Bakersfield gas station. It was 1961. Jackson was 19 years old, and he received the indeterminate sentence of 1 year to life.
Well, I was incarcerated under a 1 to life. A term they called for 1 to life, where I could have done 1 year and been released. I've done 10. That's more time than anybody in the state has ever done on a 1 to life.
He got 1 year to life and ended up spending almost 10 years and 7 months, 8 months in prison. And most people gonna remember George Jackson for the biggest riot in San Quentin history, where 3 police got killed, 3 COs, so to speak, and 3 convicts, and including George Jackson himself. But nothing like that happened before George Jackson. Nothing like that happened after George Jackson. So to give you a brief understanding, a lot of people hear us talk about the Aryan Brotherhood and the DC Blacks. Now that's something that occurred, you know, like late 70s, early 80s. It went on back and forth. But before that, because a lot of people don't know that the Aryan Brotherhood really came out the California Department of Corrections anyway. It had been about 3 or more killings of black convicts and prisoners in San Quentin, which is in California. Is a California Department of Corrections, is a state prison, and they were segregating it. So, you know, this is in, you know, the late 60s. You know, it was real racial in prisons, in the federal prisons and in the state prisons, but specifically in the state prisons. And George Jackson just wasn't going for that. I want to focus on the San Quentin issue and how the Soledad brothers was charged with the murder of a police, because after they had this big altercation on the rec yard after it had been segregated in San Quentin, the blacks and the whites went out on a mixed rec yard, and there was a racist CO in the tower. When the blacks and the whites got into it, W.L. Nolan, legendary prisoner from California, a good friend of George Jackson, a prison boxer, a championship boxer. When they went outside and they got they got into it with the white guys, this guard in the tower shot 3 black people, shot 3 black men that day.
On the morning of January 13th, 1970, a new exercise yard was opened at Soledad's notorious O-Wing. The prison grapevine had long predicted that a fight between black and white inmates would occur. Revenge was the motive because of the previous racial killings of blacks.
I would say the majority of people in Soledad knew that when the new exercise yard was open, that there would be a fight out there.
At around 9 a.m., a racially mixed group of inmates began entering the yard. W.L. Nolan, a prison boxing champion and Jackson's closest political ally, was among them.
We said, well, get on the court, the basketball court. Everyone pick your man. When everyone's set, then we'll do it.
The guard in the tower was O.G. Miller, white, 51 years old, known to be an expert with a rifle. Miller's background was similar to that of other guards. Ex-military, from a southern state, known to inmates as a racist.
He was going to shoot somebody black. If it was a fight out there on the yard or somewhere, he wasn't going to shoot his kind. He was going to shoot the other guy.
The fight started when Nolan threw the first punch at a white inmate. Others quickly joined the battle.
Shots rang out.
Without warning, Officer Miller fired his weapon at the inmates.
Nolan was the first one shot. He was shot through the chest on the first bullet off of a .30 caliber, very high-powered rifle. He was shot right in the heart.
It was straight up murder.
Then a third shot fired, hitting 2 other black inmates. Both would bleed to death. A white inmate had also been wounded. 3 days later, on January 16th, the Monterey County Grand Jury ruled the killings justifiable homicide.
You just didn't kill us like that. And then dudes were saying like, damn, we dying, why are we dying by ourselves? And that was the attitude that everybody,
Not long after the ruling had been announced, outrage turned into retribution. At around 6:30 p.m., 26-year-old guard John Mills was beaten and thrown from the top tier of Y-Wing.
Mills was killed not because he was Mills, it was because he was a guard, to pay back for the Opie Miller shooting.
There was a note left on him. 1 down, 2 to go. That was stated really clearly.
According to prison authorities, there were inmates black and white who witnessed the killing of Officer Mills.
And the thing that killed me was them saying that they could hear Mills's keys jangling in the air as he fell, or was thrown from the 3rd tier down to the bottom.
George Jackson, Fleta Drumgo, and John Clouchet became the primary suspects in the killing of Officer Mills. Clouchet denied any involvement.
So you were not involved in the assault or killing of John Mills?
No.
Did you see anyone assault or kill John Mills?
No.
Do you know if George Jackson, in fact, killed John Mills?
No.
W.L. Nolan was shot and killed on the rec yard, and these other brothers were shot and killed on the rec yard. So just think about that. These dudes were so serious, whoever they were, but we attributing the story to George Jackson because the story is about George Jackson, that one of their comrades got shot and killed, 2 more got shot and killed, and they locked him down. And they said, yo, the police is the enemy. Because for people who don't know, people think George Jackson was a racist. In all actuality, George Jackson was an internationalist. Like, he read He read Sun Tzu. He read things about Che Guevara. He read things from Vietnam. He read things from China. He read things from Africa. He read things from the Middle East. He was an educator of anything that pertained to survival for his people. And if you had to work with white people, he was cool with that. He was of the same philosophy of a person like, say, Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton, anybody who know the history of Fred Hampton and what went on with him, he wasn't against Spanish people or Hispanics. He wasn't against white people. He was against the system. He was against fascists. He was against oppression. So he told Spanish people and white people that was from the ghettos from where he was from, let's get together. Many people have been interviewed in regards to this George Jackson matter, ABs and all that, Mexican mafias and all that. And they said that after George converted in mentality and thinking to a revolutionary mindset as opposed to a convict criminal mindset.
To fellow inmate James Carr when the two became leaders of a gang known as the Wolf Pack. Much of her time was spent in the usual convict hustles.
He knew how to play the game. He was a tough guy. He studied martial arts. He was, he was strong, very muscular, very smart, very cunning guy.
Good behavior dictated Jackson's chance for parole. It became non-existent. Prison records indicate that he received over 40 disciplinary actions. Jackson spent 7 years in solitary.
He was a big guy. He was a tough guy. He was a predator when he was in the general population. He was a predator of other inmates. He just abused people.
He became a professional prisoner, a real dyed-in-the-wool convict.
And then he started reading revolutionary theory. Then he started reading Marx and Lenin and Mao. And he wrote, I read Marx and Lenin and Mao and they redeemed me. All of a sudden, he had a context for his anger. He realized, why he was there, why people of his race, of his working class background, why they were in prison in disproportionate numbers. And that was the appeal of George Jackson. He represented in the highest way the injustice of the system and the cruelty and the institutionalized racism of the system.
He was telling everybody, yo, it's not about black and white, it's about us against the man. Just imagine, San Quentin was a terrible racist smorgasbord of events, so to speak. Anybody who watch our channel over here, the DC Blacks channel, you all know that we do a whole lot of conversations about ADX and Marion and Supermaxes and lockdowns. Well, San Quentin was a maximum security prison, okay? And inside this maximum security prison, they had a place called the Adjustment Center. The Adjustment Center is like control unit in Marion. If you follow any of our stories, and we talking about 8-unit control unit, they got the regular lockdown blocks, they got the box cars. Control unit is similar to ADX right now. So you went there, there's no telling what you went through in there. And remember, this was the 60s. The racism, the tension, the oppression from the white COs, it was on another level. And while, the nation got to know who George Jackson and the Soledad brothers was through this case, in the process of it, George Jackson encountered a lot of things. I read this book many times, young and old. I just read it again recently. Like, it's just constantly revealing things. But nevertheless, I believe that George Jackson, he had his back against the wall and he wasn't really going for nothing. Like, in all the stories I read about dudes that was revolutionaries or dudes that was against the system that was in the prison system in the 60s and the 70s, George Jackson stood out to me. And I want to send a big shout out to a brother, man, by the name of Ned McAllister. I met his older brother when I first got to prison. I went to prison at 16. And his older brother, shout out to Dirk McAllister, was one of my first mentors in maximum security down in Lawton. And then I met his younger brother, Ned McAllister, later. And he did something that really kind of changed my life. He gave me a book called Comrade George. So he introduced me to George Jackson. And after I read Comrade George, then I read Blood in My Eyes, and then I read Soledad Brothers, and then I understood that their struggle wasn't about a racist thing. It was a thing about, for me, I got to standing up to the system, but they consider, standing up to the system is standing up to fascism and white supremacy. And, all that is cool, but it made me understand the principles of unity. It made me understand the principles of, us against them and what the stakes really are. But nevertheless, shout out to Ned for giving me that book.